Welcome to Wellness with John, resources to help you thrive. I'm John Peters, and this is episode 5 of a 7-part series I'm doing explaining acceptance and commitment therapy. So if you haven't watched the previous ones, I'll put a link up here and you can go back and start from the beginning and then come up to this one. But in this episode, I am going to talk about observing the self. And there are multiple ways that we work with this in ACT. And so I'm going to unpack those for you and give you some practical advice in this video about how to do that for yourself right here. Okay? Stay tuned. Okay, so in this video, I want to talk about observing the self and some related concepts and techniques that we use in ACT. And just to review what we've covered in the past episodes, we talked about cognitive diffusion, so not being fused with particular elements of our experience, okay? And we talked about the concept of acceptance, which is both kind of an attitude and also a mode of being in turning toward and working with constructively issues that we want to deal with, we want to change, we want to improve, right? And we also talked about mindfulness and its important role in helping with diffusion and helping with acceptance and helping with lowering stress, right? And so in this video, I want to talk about the ways that we use observing the self in ACT. And just to zoom out a little bit, in therapy, we have the broad field of cognitive behavioral therapy, and that started many decades ago in the middle of the last century. And toward the end of the last century, there were several types of therapy that started to emerge and that we therapists embraced that were influenced by Eastern psychology. And so that's why today we have people like me who practice mindfulness-based cognitive therapy and forms of therapy that fall into that umbrella category, including dialectical behavioral therapy. I made a video on that, and I'll put a link up here if you want to go watch that one. But ACT is also a mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, and it is influenced by Eastern psychology. And I'm going to make some videos actually after this series where I talk about specific ways that Western therapists incorporate Eastern psychology into practice. But obviously, mindfulness is one, because mindfulness is a form of meditation that's been practiced in Asia for quite a long time before actually modern Western psychology existed, right? So that's an example of something that has been integrated into Western psychology quite broadly now. But observing the self is also an element of Eastern psychology that we are incorporating into Western psychology, and in particular in acceptance and commitment therapy. And this is different from some other forms of mindfulness-based therapies like DBT, because in ACT, we work with the self both as a method for deepening awareness of issues, but also for helping people rewrite their stories, helping people achieve their goals, and helping people become more resilient in dealing with what we call existential issues. Existential issues have to do with those deeper issues of how I exist in the world and how I'm experiencing my world and how I'm dealing with normative life transitions and things like that. So this is, I know this is a little abstract, and this episode is probably going to be the most abstract of all of them, but I'm going to make this practical, I promise, or I'm going to try at least. We'll see. So here's one way that we sometimes help people understand how to work with the self. And this actually flows naturally if we are working with cognitive diffusion, like I talked about in the first episode, because when we diffuse from particular elements of particular moments, we often have a deeper and broader view of ourself, and we don't just get subsumed into, I'm angry at Tom, Tom is a jerk. We get perspective on that, which is part of what diffusion is designed to do for us. But when we work with the self, we are working with perspective because we are working with the fact that any given moment has an experience that I might define as me or mine. But if you think about it, your life is full of, an infinite sequence of moments, and each of those moments has a unique configuration of qualities. And even though there are stable things throughout one's life, like one might say, yeah, I've always been an extrovert and I'm still an extrovert. I expect to always be an extrovert. So there's stable elements of how we experience ourselves and the way that we interface with our world. But we often get subsumed and fused with some of those elements in ways that are not enlivening, not constructive, and they become part of a narrative that is actually limiting or even damaging. So if you think about, for example, someone who has low self-esteem and they are constantly noticing some element of their experience that affirms the reason that they think negatively about themselves, like let's say that a person successfully gets up, successfully gets ready, successfully gets in the car and drives to meet a friend on time successfully to play tennis. And they haven't played tennis before, and the friend's going to show them how to play tennis. And then they play some tennis, and the person decides that they suck at tennis. And so that experience of failing at performing at tennis the way they wanted to instantly translates into them saying, I suck, I'm a failure, I'm no good at sports, I'm no good at trying new things. They start firing off all these narratives that are damaging to their self-esteem when they were successful at 90 things that morning between getting up and getting to the tennis thing. But then the brain just ignores those 90 things and says, oh, because I failed at learning how to hit the ball, I suck, right? And so they're fused with this negative element in a way that they're not having perspective on the self, okay? So that's one way to think about it. But another way to think about it is a practice that we sometimes do with people. I've actually done this practice in workshops, both ones where I was a participant and workshops that I've led before, in order to help people have perspective on observing the self. I'll tell you the intense way that we've done it in the workshop, but you don't necessarily have to do it this deeply. But in the workshop, what we did was we paired up. So there were two of us in each pair, and the leader of the workshop set a 5-minute timer. Okay, and for 5 straight minutes, person A was going to ask person B, "Who are you?" And person B would answer that in any way that they are going to answer. So the person, like I might say, I'm a therapist. And then my colleague would say, okay, thank you, John. Thanks for sharing that. Who are you? Asking me again. Okay. I'm a person sitting here talking to another person. Thank you, John. Okay. Who are you? I'm a parent. I have a daughter. I'm a parent. Thank you. Who are you? I'm a person sitting in this chair. Thank you. Who are you? Over and over for 5 straight minutes, right? And part of what that does, it kind of blows out that part of your brain temporarily that is often fused with one particular element of your experience and expanding it out into your entire identity to the occlusion of other aspects of who you are and your capacities and your strengths, right? And this comes from Eastern psychology because Eastern psychology, which comes out of this is particularly Buddhist, it posits that the self that we think we are is not our true self. And we get caught up in these deluded kinds of notions of who we are, but those notions on inspection can easily be seen as inadequate. Because if I examine any one of those elements that I might have said in that exercise, I'm a therapist. Well, that describes me in part. It describes me right now. What if I retire tomorrow? I'm not a therapist anymore, right? So this type of exercise is a way to examine the different things that our brain tends to come up with in terms of defining us, both in terms of these broad I'm a therapist roles, but even I'm a person sitting in this chair, because I might stand up and then I'm not sitting in the chair. So there's a self that is John, that is the self that can observe the elements of myself that are part of me, but they're just parts of me. They're not the true self. They're not the whole self, right? So one way you can do this at home, if you want to play with this idea, is get out a sheet of paper, and you only have to do this even 10 times. So 10 times on the sheet of paper, you're going to start the sentence, I am blank, and you're going to fill in the blank, okay? And then you finish that, you do a second time. I am, it could be anything. As long as you finish the sentence and it's coherent, you're doing it fine. I am blah, blah, blah. I am blah, blah, blah. I am blah, 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 right? And one way to do that is you get your 10 things and then just look and say, yeah, those are 10 things, but there's actually even more that I didn't cover in those 10. That's one way to have this perspective. Another way to have this perspective is cross out one of your 10 and say, okay, if that one isn't the true me, or if that one changes, these other 9 may still be true. Or what if I cross out 2? What if I cross out all 10, right? There is a self that is me that can be aware of the elements of myself in order to have a deeper notion of who I am. And part of what this leads to as well, going back to the quality of acceptance, that component of ACT, that in order to have deep acceptance that is resilient, that actually helps us in challenging situations, we need to develop a stable sense of ourself that is not so frequently and strongly assailed by the turbulence of life, right? Somehow we need to have a center to be grounded, right? And if we don't examine the self, it's hard to find, develop, and then benefit from having that grounded center, because we get fused with these elements, right? If I get super duper fused and my ego's all tied up with John as therapist, what happens if I lose this job? What happens if I retire? You know, that's going to be a hard hit to my ego and challenging to adjust to, right? And I'm not talking about adopting an attitude of apathy and saying, well, I don't care if I'm a therapist. I don't care if I'm sitting in this chair or standing up. I don't care about anything, okay? We're not aiming toward apathy. And I talked about that a little bit when I talked about acceptance. I'm going to come back around to this idea of acceptance and equanimity as not apathy in a later video. So watch the channel for that. But I'm not talking about neutrality as in we don't care about anything, but we're talking about a somewhat neutral stance toward any particular element of our experience of ourself or our world, so that we have a stable, grounded sense of ourself from which we are viewing and responding to our world, if that makes some sense, right? So if you do the exercise that I suggested just earlier about I am blah, 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 you can get a taste of working with the self, because what we're trying to do is work with the self as context, okay, as opposed to the self as content. When we are fused with an experience and it just blows up and takes over our whole perception of ourself and the universe, like when we're super duper angry about something, that is self as content, and we are expanding our sense of I am mad, you know. The content of being mad becomes the self, and that's self as content. But if I am able to be defused and say, okay, I'm a person who in this moment happens to be feeling anger. I am thinking angry thoughts about what Tom did yesterday. I start to become defused from that. Who's the one taking a look at that stuff? Okay, it's my deeper self that's able to be diffused. The more we practice diffusion, the more we practice acceptance, the more we develop our practice of mindfulness, which helps with diffusion and acceptance and a good sense of self, then this all these different parts of ACT work together to help us not only cope effectively with whatever problem we might have had in focus when we began the process of ACT, but it ends up deepening our sense of self and our sense of groundedness and our resiliency, which generalizes out into our life, which is one of the reasons ACT is such a powerful modality of therapy, because yes, it can address specific goals like I want to be less anxious, but it in the process deepens that person's ability to be resilient, okay, in these ways. So that's what we mean by observing the self in ACT. And by the way, I want to take a little break here and just tell you that if you want to practice some techniques that are in the modality of ACT in order to lower your stress and anxiety, I have a free ebook that's available. Just go to go to courses.johnpeters.online/free stress ebook. I'll put the link down in the description below. But you can get that free ebook. It's got 7 lessons on some easy to learn, easy to practice techniques that it will reliably help you lower your anxiety and stress. Feel free to grab that ebook. Okay. So in the next episode, which will be episode 6, I'm going to talk about values and why we focus on values in ACT and how values can matter in terms of coping with specific therapeutic goals, but also, again, deepening your sense of your own resiliency and having that generalize out so that you deal with your world in an effective way and thrive. Okay, thanks for joining me with this video, and hit the like button below if you like this kind of content. Feel very free to subscribe and check out the free ebook. And of course, I enjoy comments and shares of my videos as well. And I'll see you in the next episode.